that's kind of the way I see music education as well. You're not really teaching someone to play the saxophone. Playing the saxophone in itself isn't really interesting. Being a musician is interesting, but being a musician is only interesting when you're being a good human somehow. So kind of starting from the top down and imagining it as kind of creating humans that know how to interact, know how to listen, know how to collaborate, know how to talk about things. Only good music can come from that.
It makes me quite uncomfortable. But also there is craft. There is...
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like anything.
Metronomes are useful.
It's about balance, isn't it? Like, that's what I tell my students. I say life's like skateboarding. It's all about balance. They have to laugh because they're my students. If this were all just once, it'd all be alright. You could be alright, you could be alright, you could be alright. If this were all just once, it'd all be alright.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I've forgotten your last name on the spot.
Hyde.
Hyde.
H-Y-D-E.
Welcome, Joshua Hyde, to the Baroque podcast. I'm so sorry to disrespect you so early.
It's not the first time. Probably won't be the last.
Yeah, you kind of want it to be that way, hey? Kind of want a little disrespect every now and then, or you'll start getting inflated, I think.
Yeah, you don't want to be inflated.
Yeah, but that said, I didn't mean to deflate you.
It's all right.
Well, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself? I know you as an amazing sax player.
Thank you.
I know that you're a professor, and I previously just told you how I forgot where. And I'm going to leave it there and let you introduce yourself.
Well, I guess I'm a saxophone player. I guess that's the easiest way to put it. I play with a bunch of different groups. So I have a group here in Paris called Soundinitiative that does like experimental kind of physical music performances involving dance and space and installations and things. I play with a group in Australia called Elision, which does kind of hardcore new music. I play with a group in Cologne called Musikfabrik that does more kind of what I would call anyways, standard kind of new music.
How do you spell that one?
Musikfabrik, Musikfabrik.
Okay.
Musikfabrik. Lots of K's. It's German, cool. So you got to have K's.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not okay. And I play with a group in Montreal called a duo with a percussionist called Scapegoat, and another group there called Noam, which is more like combining saxophone, acoustic instruments with electronics, so through like guitar pedals, as you can see here on the floor. So like creating.
Trying to get some B-roll of that.
So making like meta instruments. And having performer-controlled electronics as part of the kind of instrumental gesture. I also compose and improvise and do whatever else. And I also teach. So I'm a professor at the it's called the University of. In English, well, in French it's called La Haute École de Musique de Genève. In English it's called the Geneva Music University, I think, which is part of the University of Applied Sciences of Western Switzerland, I think it's called in English.
Sounds very fancy.
Yeah,
especially compared to Haute École, high school.
Yeah,
directly translated.
Well, it's a bit of a weird story because obviously it's Geneva, so they speak French, so they have more of the French culture of music education, which is the conservatoire. And so in France, you would call it the conservatoire régional, if it was a regional conservatory, and then you would call it the conservatoire supérieur, so the superior conservatory, which like we have here in Paris, and there's one in Lyon. But surrounding areas, so in Belgium, for example, they have a conservatory, but it's not the superior. It's called the Royal Conservatory because they still have a royal family. And in Geneva, because it's Switzerland, it was for a time called the Conservatoire Supérieur de Genève, which sounds better in French. But when they introduced the university systems after the Bologna reforms, they took the translation of the German. I think you could only explain it like that, because in German, when you have in Germany and in Switzerland, you call it the Musikhochschule, which is if you translate it directly into English, means music high school. But in high school, in Germany, high school is called a Gymnasium, like a gymnasium. So I mean, all the words are kind of the same, but they mean different things. It's very confusing. So in French, they've taken the translation of Musikhochschule and they've called it Haute École de Musique, which just sounds weird when you translate it back again into English, the high school for music. But basically, it's the Superior Conservatory of Geneva, or the university.
So what you're saying is you're in High School Musical.
That's pretty much that. That's my life. I haven't seen that film, but I think I see what it's about, and it's pretty much like that. I go to school and dance around and sing.
So sweet. Maybe play basketball? Ever play basketball?
I have done. Is that in that film as well?
Yeah. The male love interest is a basketball.
Oh, right. Okay.
One of his passions.
To be honest, I haven't seen a lot of basketball in Geneva, but maybe.
All right.
I'll send an email.
An email?
Yeah, to try and get someone
who?
in. I don't know, to the director to get someone in to play basketball.
I see. All right. Trying to organize you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, to Geneva?
Yeah,
to
just
ask where the basketball is?
Just in the canton of Geneva. Please, sir, could I play basketball? Yeah, and so I do. That's my teaching. I'll do some other teaching as well. I'm also a pedagogical coordinator of the Asia Pacific Saxophone Academy, which happens every year in Bangkok.
Wow.
Which was happening every year up until COVID, and we're having our first edition post-COVID in July, which is exciting.
Wow.
Because it was a big event. We had, I think, the last edition we had about 150 students from all the way from Japan down to New Zealand, and across Asia, the United States, and Europe as well. About 40 faculty, I think. But obviously, COVID meant that the edition of 2020, 2021, and 2022 didn't happen.
Yeah.
So.
And is that like classical saxophone oriented, or is it all sorts? What is it?
It's saxophone oriented. I kind of see it as more of a really a cultural thing. The saxophone's more of a pretext just to get together. Because, all these different countries have such a complicated history with each other. Like Asia, like all continents, is kind of a fractious history, and so I think it's really interesting that we'll just get together around this bendy tube, and just kind of we make music together, but you also eat together, and you go out and visit the city together, and you create like a saxophone quartet, or it's just nice. It's just a really amazing event, I think. So I always see it like that, and that's kind of the way I see music education as well. You're not really teaching someone to play the saxophone. Playing the saxophone in itself isn't really interesting. Being a musician is interesting, but being a musician is only interesting when you're being a good human somehow. So kind of starting from the top down and imagining it as kind of creating humans that know how to interact, know how to listen, know how to collaborate, know how to talk about things. Only good music can come from that. Whereas if you focus on people just playing the saxophone and say, no, that's too slow, that's out of tune, that's whatever it is, like, there have been so many people that have had amazing careers and really spoken to people with music who have played out of tune, who have played wrong, who haven't played fast enough. That's not what it's about at the end of the day. And I think if you have a goal that is, clearly human or whatever it is, the rest is all sorts itself out. Like the intonation and rhythm or whatever, like it'll sort itself out. It's not that interesting.
That's so interesting. Well, that sounds like a lovely philosophical stance, I guess, for teaching. And it also makes me quite uncomfortable. I'm like, what?
Why? In what way does it make you uncomfortable?
I'm not quite sure. I can only notice the feeling at this point. It's new.
Yeah.
But
did you practice too many scales?
Maybe. I think it might be that I took to heart those philosophical tenets quite early, and am someone who struggles with details, and so I'm actually now finally paying attention to things like tempo and pitch and all this in a fine detailed way, because I just never actually refined my craft adequately, I think, at least by my standards, to really communicate well on any instrument. Maybe my singing was and has been okay for a long time, but I think that might be why it's like. But also there is craft. There is.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's like anything.
Metronomes are useful.
It's about balance, isn't it? Like, so I tell my students, I say, life's like skateboarding. It's all about balance. They have to laugh because they're my students. But it's about balance. So you're right. I mean, if you can go too far in the other way, you can kind of be all about the vibe and not be able to play the horn. That's for sure. But I think you have to find a balance. And I do feel that at least in the classical saxophone community, and to be honest, probably in the jazz community as well, saxophone playing has become this real technical kind of thing where we're all keen on doing these competitions where you have to play as fast and as perfect as possible. But you don't think about what pieces you're playing because they're on a list, or you don't think about whatever it is. So I guess it's. I don't think it's a reaction to that. I think it's always a good starting point. But I do feel that we need that more in our kind of milieu.
Yeah, I see that. And sax is a weird instrument because it's kind of like you can play stuff that other instruments can play just a bit easier or something, or like sax players seem to be able to play like a bit faster and do like more flexible stuff with our embouchure and stuff than say a clarinet player or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean,
I notice sax it's like this wild virtuosic instrument. Well, compared to a trumpet, say, they always get compared.
Well, essentially, that's why it exists. That's how it came to be. When Napoleon III, sorry, rejigged all the military orchestras in France. Adolphe Sax was kind of called to fix them up. So obviously,
it still makes me laugh. So,
Adolphe Sax, being the businessman that he was like, oh, you know what? You need to fix all those military orchestras. All of my instruments, they'll make them great. So you still have in military bands today in France and subsequently in other places, sax horns. I don't know if you've ever heard of a sax horn.
No
one's ever heard of sax horn. Imagine if you mixed a euphonium and a tenor horn. Tenor horn looks like it's kind of like a really thin euphonium. Euphonium's kind of like a tiny tuba.
Right. Okay.
Sax
horn. Imagine it. I've never seen this.
It's kind of in the middle of a euphonium and a tenor horn.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can play the euphonium or the tenor horn, you could play a sax horn, but it does have apparently some very specific things. How true that is. I mean, I think there's only one class in the world in the conservatories here in Paris of sax horn.
Wow.
Because they need people to be able to play for these orchestras, because there's still jobs. You can get a job playing the sax horn in the military orchestras in France. As you can saxophones, and so at the same time, the saxophone was invented, he patented it in 1846, and essentially what he wanted was an instrument that could play as fast as the winds and as loud as the brass. So you basically have a clarinet on steroids, or a really virtuosic kind of trumpet. So it's exactly what you're saying. So that's kind of the blessing and a curse for the saxophone, because we can do everything. It just nobody wants to hear it.
Yeah, you get excluded from a lot of clubs.
Yeah. So it's kind of a tricky place to be in, where you're kind of this kind of weird muscle car that's not allowed on the streets, but also can't play on the Formula One circuit. It's kind of like it's kind of weird position to be in. But I think it's one that has a lot of opportunities and a lot of things to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I went to see Mary's sax quartet, or one of them. I've forgotten what it's called, and I feel bad. Again, it's going to be one of those days. But that was my first time seeing a sax quartet, and it just blew my mind. I was like, wow, this is so loud and so in tune. And they were just a wonderful instrument, or like a wonderful ensemble.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great instrument. I mean, I've been playing it for...
long enough to desensitize.
Long enough to know how long have I playing? 20, almost 25 years, I guess. Wow. The saxophone.
What age did you pick it up? And this is the perfect segue. I've never had such a good one to like your childhood and stuff.
I picked it up when I was when I first started high school, so it would have been like 12, I guess. So I must have been playing it for 24 years.
And that's to me, that sounds somewhat late for someone who winds up doing like full pro
I'd
thing.
played the recorder.
Right.
Obviously, the classics start with recorder and then piano. Right. and so I'd already sung in choirs and done music theory and all those kind of things. So by the time I kind of started the saxophone, I already knew how music worked, and that's, to be honest, the way that I always recommend that students, if you want to begin the saxophone, go about it, because the saxophone, I mean, it's a big thing. So like if you're, I don't know if you can see it, it's a big beast. If you're like 6 or 7 years old, which is the age that you start in France, you can't physically reach the keys. And also, that's just my doorbell ringing. I don't know.
Probably Vicky.
No.
Take a break? No,
shouldn't be.
Do you want to go check?
No, it'll be a parcel or something. They'll come back.
Okay.
So they physically can't reach the keys, which means that you kind of end up keeping these physical problems. Let's take a break.
Yeah, let's take a break. Okay.
Sorry about that. Apparently that was a very important letter that needed to have my signature. So I was saying that basically when you start saxophone, if you're very small...
I can't believe you kept your train of thought. That's amazing. I had totally forgotten.
We're talking about saxophone. This is golden thing.
Ooh. Yeah, we're in your beautiful studio. I didn't say that before.
Yeah.
And you're obviously a guitar player.
I have some guitars.
You do.
I have 2 guitars. I'm not very good at them. Actually, I practiced the other day, and and it really hurts. I don't know how you guys do it. It really...
I think you have to practice more than once. I think that's the...
Oh, is that? I thought guitar was easy. You just do it once, and it was like good.
Yeah. I mean, you might be right. You were probably great. No. You just have to pay the price of...
Really hurt. Like, I got a blister and everything. Anyway, so when you start very small, you end up with all these physical problems, like the relationship, the physical relationship you have with the instrument is kind of got its memory of...
You really... I remember seeing people in the, like, late primary school band. Did you have the... I think we grew up in different states, but we had, like, a band program for year 5 and 6 primary school. And yeah, a lot of the kids like struggling with this
trombone
thing.
Or like the tuba. And so like that, but what most importantly for me is that like when you play the saxophone, it's not an in-tune instrument. Like if you blow into it just however, like it's not going to be in tune. You have to kind of know where the note's supposed to be, and then you make it that. So if you start on a saxophone, your interior ear ends up being whatever out of tune.
True, you might give yourself imperfect pitch.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so for those 2 reasons, I always discourage people from starting their kids early. I would say, go learn piano, go sing in a choir.
I think I have choir pitch. I feel like I hear things a little weirdly tuned depending on where they sit at a choir.
But that's playing with other people. That's music. And so somehow for me, I never really felt like a saxophone player. I always felt like a pianist. Like a bad pianist that played saxophone as a day job.
Nice. Is that still how you feel?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I always, because my first job was playing piano. When I was 15, I was doing every Friday and Saturday night, like playing jazz in a restaurant. And I only really...
Is this, where'd you grow up? Is this...
In Ballarat.
In Ballarat.
Yeah. So it was the fanciest restaurant in Ballarat. I used to go every Friday and Saturday from when I was 15 till when I left home.
Awesome. Did they pay you?
Yeah. No, it was great. I was like earning, I think it was like $30 an hour, and my friends were earning like $7 an hour. Or something. So I was like,
that's good.
It was great.
15-year-old.
And so like that was like really, I'm not very good at maths.
It's pretty bad now that I think of it in terms of just like a person, but I guess it's what you can get as a human.
When you're like 15, it's fine.
And what a restaurant can pay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I forgot what I was going to say.
It's because I interrupted.
My train of thought.
I derailed.
It's derailed.
You grew up in Ballarat. You're talking about identifying as a piano player.
Yeah. So what I actually was going to say, I'm not very good at maths, but twice a week, 3 hours times. By the time, because I did it in Melbourne as well, I did it in Federation Square for a couple of years.
Whoa! What do you mean? You
playing
played
piano,
like busked, or was it?
No, like in a restaurant. There's a
I see.
really fancy restaurant in Federation Square where I used to play. Have like a grand piano in the middle of the restaurant, and so I was over about 5 years. So that's like a lot of hours of just playing and listening and kind of. And that for me was really important time just to play, just to really get those hours up. And so I'd done that for 3 years, and I kind of did I didn't really know how you were supposed to do anything. Like you're going to university.
So this is what you moved to Melbourne to study.
Yeah.
And that's why you're doing these gigs.
Yeah. So I moved to Melbourne, and no one really told me all about all the different musical institutions. I known about the VCA, the Victorian College of the Arts, because there was a poster in our music room at high school. And then one of my teachers was like, yeah, you should go there. That's a really good place. I was like, great. And so I just did 3 auditions there and nowhere else.
3, like for different courses, or 3 years in a row?
Jazz piano, jazz saxophone, and classical saxophone. I did classical saxophone because my teacher was like, yeah, that'll motivate you to like practice for your exams or something. Okay. And I didn't get into any of them.
All right.
And I was like, oh shit, I probably should have auditioned somewhere else. But I didn't. And then I ended up auditioning for like a TAFE course, and I started a TAFE course out in Box Hill. And then I got a phone call. Like I don't know if you know Melbourne, but Box Hill's quite far.
Yeah, I studied in Melbourne, so.
Right, yeah, so Box Hill's like pretty far from Melbourne.
Yeah.
So I was living in Box Hill, like on the other side of Box Hill. And then I get a call, and they're like, oh, we have the person that got the saxophone spot didn't come, so do you want to come to the VCA? And classical saxophone.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, great, thinking that I would transfer into jazz, because at that time all I wanted to be was a jazz musician. That was pretty much all I was doing. And I enrolled in this TAFE course. It was a jazz course.
Right. What's the school called?
The Box Hill TAFE. Yeah. That was like one of the feeder schools for the VCA. I didn't know about it until I didn't get into the VCA, but a lot of people were like, oh yeah, you usually don't get in like the first time.
Yeah,
you do like a feeder school, and then
right.
So I'd enrolled there thinking I would audition for the next year, but then I was like, oh, I'll do classical saxophone for a bit, and then try and switch over. It's probably easier when you're in there. And I loved it. Like, it was great. That course was really amazing. Very small class sizes, super small class sizes, lots of contact time. And I was playing with all the guys in the jazz department. I had like a quartet. I would take the classes, and so I was just kind of doing everything all at once. So it was just amazing. I had like 4 years of just doing all the music all the time. It was great.
And you liked it?
Yeah, that was a really, really amazing time. I just practiced so much, did so much music, writing stuff with the jazz quartet, doing like saxophone quartet, doing all kinds of stuff. It was really great.
Wow.
And then one day my teacher was like, yeah, you should go overseas and study overseas.
Like your private sax teacher?
Yeah, my saxophone teacher was just like, yeah.
Do you want to give him a shout out?
Barry Cockcroft. I don't know if he listens to podcasts or if he's on the internet. Hey, Barry.
Hi, Barry.
Barry Cockcroft is a very important kind of figure in my musical life, because he also grew up in Ballarat. And I remember when I was about, I don't know how old I would have been, maybe 13 or 14, maybe later. He came back to Ballarat and did a recital. Because his high school was just across the road from my high school. And I saw it and I was like, wow, that's amazing. And he had just been studying in France.
Right.
So I was like, wow, I want to be like him.
That's why he told you to go
do that.
Yeah.
And then he ended up being my teacher years later. And he was like, yeah, you should go and study overseas. So he's always kind of been a mentor to me. And yeah, he told me to go overseas. And I was like, where should I go? And he's like, I don't know. I went to Bordeaux and it was good, so you should go there. I was like, okay. And then 6 months later, I was living in Bordeaux.
That's huge.
Yeah, it was it's a big change.
I bet, yeah. Did you speak French at that time?
I did it, the only reason I kept doing it at high school was because I knew that one day maybe I would want to study in France. Because I hated French in high school. I was like, because that teacher was like 150 years old, and it was just horrible, and she'll kick me out of class every time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I didn't like
it. Goof around, or?
I don't even remember, probably.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. I just hated it. But I did it until the end. I got really bad marks. But in my head somehow I was like, yeah, maybe one day I'll go and study in France. I probably should do this. Or something.
Wow. You had some presence of mind. Or like, at that age, I think I was planning to kill myself at 30. So I didn't really have such...
I don't know if it was presence of mind or... I don't know. Like, high school for me was just like a big jumble of doing the stuff I liked. My VCE was music, cinema studies, visual arts, like painting.
That sounds pretty nice.
Which is just the stuff I wanted to do, and then like whatever the easiest stuff I could do to get away with, So I did like English literature, and then French I did, and then I think I did like psychology by distance education. Or something.
Wow.
So I was either I was mostly in the art rooms or the practice rooms for my high school, which was great.
Yeah, that sounds nice.
Yeah, it was good.
It's like a lot of people say high school was like absolutely horrible for them. That doesn't sound like it was.
I mean, parts of it were horrible. Mm-hmm. Like, going to an all-boys school in the country, it's pretty horrible.
Yeah, right.
But the actual part of like being in the art room or in the music room and just kind of doing your thing, that was good.
What's horrible about it, going to an all-boys school in the country? Like,
I don't know. Just imagine 1,000 boys in one place, in the middle of nowhere in Australia.
It's hard for me because I had an unusually good experience at an all-boys school in Canberra, which is maybe a little different. It's not really in the country. But there's not a lot to do in Canberra.
Yeah.
But they were sort of, by the time I moved there, so I only went there in year 10, people were, and maybe it was an exceptional year, in fact I think it was, but people were really warm and encouraging, and like it was a lovely community. Like there were fights and bullying and stuff, but my experience of it was surprisingly lovely.
Okay, lovely
and
stuff.
So I'm trying to...
Love's not the first word that comes to
mind. Give me some visuals. What do we got?
I mean, because you got... It's like a big school in regional Victoria, so you got kids that come in from potato farms, you got kids that come in from the outskirts of Melbourne, Bacchus Marsh, Melton. They're not great areas. Just lots of bullying, lots of fighting, lots of... there were good things, like obviously there were good things, but I think it's just hard. I think it's better now, and I think every generation gets a little bit better, but yeah, lovely is not the word that I would use.
Yeah, right.
For that experience. There's memories of just like practicing in the music rooms with someone kicking a soccer ball against the door constantly. I don't know. Yeah, so I was happy to get out of there, to be honest. I was happy to go to Melbourne. And yeah, I had a great time in Melbourne. Melbourne was amazing. And then then I arrived in France and realized that in France you can only do one thing or people think you're shit at everything.
Okay.
You can't be like, oh, hey, I play piano and I play jazz and I play classical music. I'm also a saxophone player and I also compose.
Which is like a description of all my favorite, like all the musicians I respect the most, I would say.
But
it's rare that they just play, just do one thing.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, even in the whole history of music, it's rare that people have only done one thing. It's only in the last kind of, not even 100 years that we've all kind of specialized. Kind of post-war musical education has just been, specializing in doing one thing. You compose and you do that, and then you leave the performing to the performers, and then you leave the improvising to the improvisers, and you leave the musicology to the musicologists, and everyone's kind of in their little box. Whereas, if you look at Mozart, Beethoven, Mahler, any of those people, they were conducting, they were composing, they were improvising.
And it makes for good music. Like if you can't play music and then you write music,
it doesn't make any sense.
It's weird.
It makes no sense. Yeah. But I think it's still more or less the case. But when I arrived in France, I felt very strongly that if I said I could do two things, people would be like, well, you're obviously shit at both of those things. Goodbye. And so because I'd come to study classical saxophone, that's what I did. So I did that for about 10 years and kind of only did that. And I stopped playing jazz. I stopped improvising, more or less. I stopped playing piano. Stopped composing.
That sounds very sad. How was it as an experience? Was it more like, I guess you would have been more focused on the good part. Like you were probably getting very, very good at
the saxophone. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have any regrets, but I think that once you understand how to get really good at one thing, it's easier to apply that to other things. And so with the saxophone, I really went all the way through, and I went through 2 different regional conservatories in France, went to the Superior Conservatory. I'm the only Australian to have ever been in that class, and that's the class for saxophone, because that's where Adolphe Sax used to teach. It's kind of like the home of saxophone. Was invented in Paris, so it's kind of like the home of classical saxophone. And I won international competitions and really did the thing. So I don't regret any of that. That was all fun.
Huge.
But I do know that with my students today, I'm really keen on saying, we're going to learn the saxophone, it's really important, but do you have something else that nourishes your musical being? Is it conducting or composing or arranging or improvising or whatever it is? for me, it's really important that they keep building that, because the people that you see, like you said, that come out the other side and like have a career, you know, they use their technical facility on their instrument into the service of the music they're writing, or the music they're improvising, or you know, whatever it is. Like, it's not, you can't, I don't think you can just do one thing unless you're going to play in an orchestra, which I would never want to do, and you couldn't do on a saxophone.
Yeah, right. Unless it's a very unusual orchestra.
Unless it's a very strange orchestra. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that also, I feel like even if your priority is working on one thing in a very focused way, having some kind of like something outside of that will just help you like be a healthy human. You know, like if you've got like friends and like, and maybe a hobby that isn't music and stuff. I think I've heard that like with like high paid lawyers in firms, they have to like force them to take holidays because they'll actually be more productive that way, because otherwise people who are really into just working like all the time just burn themselves out and have long periods of, not long, but longer periods than necessary of incapacity.
Yeah, for sure. So that kind of was, I mean, I really enjoyed my studies in France, but I did often feel like I was kind of you know, doing the saxophone thing, but then kind of hiding the other stuff that I was either doing or kind of wanting
secret
to be doing.
Piano.
Well, it wasn't even that. It was kind of like I would be studying classical saxophone, you know, doing the competitions and all this kind of nerdy saxophone stuff, and then I would go and like play with my new music ensemble that was doing all this weird experimental kind of music that wasn't really accepted by the saxophone kind of community, and I think it's still a little bit the case.
Is that still the case? Because I always thought, I mean, I know nothing about the saxophone community, especially not in France, but I've always put sort of heavy new music in the classical box. I've been like, they are allowed together. Other things aren't, because they don't write down the music the right way or something. But those two are like correlated.
The problem we have with the saxophone is that there's a saxophone world, like classical saxophone world. It's mega nerdy and everything's about the saxophone. So you have to play pieces that make you look good at the saxophone, pieces that are very virtuosic. And there'll be competitions. There's really big competitions. There's like a calendar of competitions that the students do, and they'll have lists of repertory. And the repertoire that's on these things is all about the saxophone, which means like it's all about making the saxophonist look good, like playing fast, clear articulation.
Which really doesn't necessarily make for amazing music.
Which most of the time makes for terrible music. And even if there are some things that are technically contemporary on them, there are always pieces that are like, this is contemporary, but it's like a super mega challenge, like to play fast or like do some weird technique, but really fast. It's going to be difficult. And so that kind of world and the kind of world of doing experimental music or actual new music, which is for the last 20 years been more about like, you know, sound, depending on which country we're talking about, but like finding sounds and really like listening and thinking about sound texture, sound color, or about like in a lot of places the last 20 years, like combining like gesture and physicality and other art forms, which aren't instrumental gestures. That doesn't line up with this idea of what the saxophone should be doing to make us look amazing. So there's this kind of fragment of the musical world, a very small one, where all the saxophone players kind of get together and they have festivals and competitions where they all play that kind of repertoire all together. And like I've done some things in that kind of world and I've won competitions in that kind of world, but none of my professional activity centers around that kind of thing. I try to avoid it as much as possible, which means you get some kickback from people who are like, oh, he only does contemporary music. And you're like, yeah, because that's what people want to listen to. Like, nobody wants to listen to what you guys are doing. Why would you do that? Like, why would you teach your students to play music that no one wants to listen to? Like, I don't know. So that's a whole like thing.
Yeah.
That is kind of worrying.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah. Like a bit of a lost, I don't know, purpose there.
Yeah, I mean, you have it as well with like classical guitar, and I think every kind of instrument to some extent has these kind of little clubs.
It gets turned into a sport. It's
like exactly that. That's exactly what
Adam Neely said that Whiplash is a great sports movie.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And that's the whole thing. It's like this sporting, if you can like measure it and if you can compete with it, then it's great. And you can't measure like a really spacey ambient improvisation, and you can't measure like tone, color, and timbre and all those kind of things. But you can measure like, oh, he played that at 160 beats per minute, and it was really clear, or whatever it was.
Yeah, in some ways it actually, well, that makes me wonder why people aren't wanting to listen to really virtuosic stuff, because a lot of lay people, or people who aren't experts, say in an art form, whether it's painting or music, find comfort in the fact that they can tell like they are playing really fast, so it must be good. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Finding audiences is the hard thing, isn't it? It's for everyone. There's so many.
That's why I'm getting into TikTok.
That's why you're into TikTok. Finding that audience on TikTok. Yeah, I don't know. It's tricky because there's so many people. There's how many billion people there? Like 8 billion or something now. I think we're approaching it. That's a lot of people. And so you would think that you'd be able to find an audience. Like every musician could do a concert every night of the week and still have at least 10 people. You know, like.
Which is that's a really reassuring thing to hear. I think especially as a younger musician, I thought I didn't necessarily believe there was a market for my music, and I've never made the weirdest of the weird music. I've been somewhere in the middle, and yeah, that's quite comforting that the people are probably there who like to listen to whatever you're doing.
The problem is always just finding them. The problem is getting to them. So you're right, there probably are people that want to listen to virtuosic saxophone. It's maybe a little bit mean of me to say that nobody wants to listen to it, but the problem is trying to find those people. I read a great thing a long time ago that was like, don't just expect the audience to come. Like the audience starts out by being, your mum, and then it's your friends, and then it's your friends' friends, and then it's your friends' friends' friends. Like you have to build your audience from the ground up, I think. I know that with Sound Initiative in my ensemble here in Paris, we started in 2011, and the first concerts, it was like, everyone's girlfriend, everyone's boyfriend, and then like maybe someone's mum, and that was it. And then like it was some of our friends, and then like I remember vividly like the first time I was like, it was a full house, and I didn't know anyone, and I was like,
what a feeling.
That's like a big deal when you're like looking at the audience. You're like, I don't know any of these people. Like normally you'd be like, oh, there's such and such this, and there's just kind of like a moment where I switch, but you have to really build, through that organic. Because if you just go, oh, we're going to do a concert, and then wait for people to come.
They just don't come.
They just don't come.
You play to an empty room.
Yeah.
That's real sad.
But like if you play and then you invite all your friends, you're like, yeah, I got this thing, I made this thing, come together. Then if it's good and they like it, the next time they're like, oh, hey, my friend is in this band. Because it's really cool to say like, oh, my friend has this band. They're like, oh, you know someone in a band? That's cool. And then their friends will come, and then maybe if that gig's good, then maybe their friends will come. So yeah, I think that first kind of while before you get to that critical mass is can be a long process.
I mean, yeah, I'm still definitely at the hauling girlfriends along for the most part, and it does definitely. I feel I have to really fight like guilt when I ask friends again. I'm like,
no,
hey guys,
you shouldn't
I got
feel
another
guilty.
gig.
No, you shouldn't feel guilty because they want to see you. They're happy for you.
Most of them. I think like 30% at least are like loyal friends, not like people who enjoy the actual process.
I don't think so. I think they're, because there's so many different layers of connection that you have with art and music. It's like and I think one of the strongest ones is the kind of the cult of personality somehow. Taylor Swift could release like an ambient death metal like didgeridoo mashup mix, and people would be like, this is amazing.
Yeah,
like,
people would show up.
And people would show up just because it's her, and so like I think that level, I always talk about that, the levels of engagement in art. It's like, you have, the problem we have in classical music is often we're like, oh, if I make the crescendo, if I make this intonation perfect, if I make like every one of these musical details perfect,
maybe they'll
maybe they'll come, maybe they'll be there, maybe it'll be amazing, and like finally people will understand, how good I am. So So we focus on this one musical layer that's interesting to musicians and people that are really like in the know about those kind of things. But then if you like zoom out, you have, you know, the kind of clothes that you're wearing on stage, you have the lighting, you have the architecture, you have the way that you interact with people before the gig, how they find out about it. You know, maybe the videos on TikTok or whatever it is. You have the story, you have the text, you have the way that you present it, you have your physical presence on stage, you have your personality, you have the instrument itself. Maybe someone's played that instrument, maybe they had someone in their family that played that instrument. There's just, and on and on and on. There's so many different things. So you only need one of these kind of points of, these anchor points to get sucked into the thing and then learn about the rest of them. But I think we get, in classical music anyway, we get bogged down with like this one layer.
Yeah, I found it quite mind-blowing when my band started talking about the way that the bands they work in, because they're sort of pros, the way they're approaching music, which, had absolutely nothing. They were like, yeah, the music's fine. We've dealt with that, which, like, I'm mostly bogged down still in that process. But, they were talking about lighting, which just, like, in really fine detail about how the lighting could match the concept of the songs and that kind of thing. And, yeah, it's very exciting. It's still something that's sort of seeping into my consciousness. There's just so much that you
It's super important. I wrote my doctorate on that subject.
On what? Sorry?
On the relationship between what we see and what we hear. It's called I call it visual amplification. So it's the way that what we see interacts with, emphasizes or kind of changes the way we hear things. I wrote it particularly about contemporary music, but there's been studies, for example, where there was like a violin competition, and they gave 3 different groups of people. They gave one group just the audio, one group just the video, and one group the video and the audio, and they asked them to rank the violinists in order of the prizes that they would have won, so from 1 to 5. And the only one that got it right was the group that didn't have the audio. They only had the video.
Wow.
So that visual connection is like super. I think that you can't compare them. You can't compare the auditive and the visual. The visual is such a direct kind of impact on us. The auditive one has a much deeper one, I think. I feel like we're much more strongly affected by sound. It's an older part of our brain.
We start doing it. Yeah. Before we can really make sense of our visual stuff, we're like crying out and getting cooed to and that kind of thing.
But like even in an evolutionary sense, like our reptilian brain, like this sound came before vision, so it's kind of an older...
Right, in terms of organisms developed ears or something like it before sight. I don't know.
So I think it affects us in a different way, but the visual stuff is like so much more direct. And so I think you can't imagine a performance without at least questioning the way it looks.
Well, yeah, actually you can tell me if you think this is the same thing. It's like partly the same thing. If you go to if you go to a gig where there are lots of people and they seem to be having a good time and you can see that, you're way more likely to have a good time than if you go to see like the same band playing just as well, where like there are 2 people, or even there are a bunch of people, they look miserable or whatever. Like maybe the bartenders are just having a bad day and everyone's grumpy. Like,
that's a good point.
You kind of pick up on that.
Pick up on the vibe. Yeah. Some people might be cynical and be like, "Why are all these people enjoying themselves? This is terrible."
That's true. That's me. I'm like, basically immune to crowds, or I tend to post myself against them, which has given me, I think it's one of the reasons it's taken me so long to understand that, like, I need to get people to the shows and help them have a good time and, like, connect with them in order for them to appreciate the music, because I think I actually, for the most part, appreciate music more in isolation. Maybe because for 10 years or so I've been, like, wankily obsessed with like trying to reject, other people's other factors. But I for example, I love going to a gig that no one came to. I'm like, yes, it's all to myself. I don't have to talk to anyone. I just get to watch. Yes. Lurk at the back and have a nice time. But that's because I'm...
Yeah. No, it's all non-musical. I think that's why it's frustrating that when you spend so long studying and practicing and just working on one element, the moment where you realize that everything else is super important, you're like, why didn't anybody fucking tell me about all this? You know, there's so much to think about.
Didn't they? Because I think I've been told everything I need to know in life, I would say, multiple times by many people. It's just that I have not been ready to take the information in, because I'm quite a blinkered person.
No one ever told me that explicitly, no.
Yeah, right.
No, I think I figured it out by doing.
And then you've got such a richness of experience open to you as well, because like, for example, the gig you came to, it's like, that was the best gig of my life by a long way, because a lot of people came and cared. And additionally, I managed to put myself in a good sort of physical situation. I felt comfortable beforehand, was able to socialize and really connect with new people before going on stage. And so the whole experience from sort of beginning to end was really, really special for me. And a few years prior, I probably would have, because I didn't understand exactly the value of human connection. I probably would have like been very nervous and gone on stage and probably had like a semi-tolerable time or bad, and then left and like avoided talking to people or had like an anxious time while talking to them, because I didn't understand like that a lot of life is good because people are part of it. I hadn't figured it out consciously or something.
Well, it's a human art form, isn't it? It's all about the humans.
Yeah. It's weird how hard that was for me to figure out. Are you? Do you differ? Do you feel like when you've performed, you've always understood that you were playing for people? Because I guess you came up a little bit more like playing for people's enjoyment. Like if you're playing in a restaurant and stuff, it's like, play these tunes that'll make us enjoy our dinner date or whatever.
I don't know if I ever thought about it as enjoyment. It was more just about like really listening to them, to know like how loud, or like how much space you could take up. Like when you're playing in a restaurant, you don't want to. You're like always background music, right? You're never like the main thing. You kind of filling in the gaps, so when people stop talking, it's not awkward, right? It's like when you're like in a silent restaurant, and like there's a lapse and a lull in the conversation. It's kind of awkward, but when there's a piano playing, like it's nice. So it's kind of this weird kind of vibe where at the beginning of the evening you'd be just like tinkering away just a little bit, because people are like already in that first conversation mode of like, oh, you've got lots of stuff to say. And then when people start eating, like you take a little bit more space. No one wants to hear people eat, so you can kind of take a bit more space. And then towards the end of the night, when people are like either gone or drunk, like then
you go wild.
That's when you have the people that come last and they're like, "Hey man, you want a tip?" And you're like, "Yeah," and they're like, "Work hard, be good to your mother." And you're like, "Fuck off." The number of times. Yeah. But I think that really taught me how to listen to an audience and really feel that connection and understand that, when you go on stage or when you're performing, the fact that you're there and you play one note, like that can mean more than doing all this virtuosic stuff. Sometimes just the fact that you're there and like kind of in communion with this audience, that taught me a lot about that, I think. I don't think I ever thought about their enjoyment.
yeah, right.
I don't know if it's a bad thing. Yeah. Just never came up.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think implicitly you did, even if you're not, like, yeah,
sure.
You're there, or you probably didn't do things that made people look upset.
No.
You're like, yes, they're frowning now, let's do more of that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was a good time. That was a really good training ground, I think.
Well, what are you doing now? Where are you now?
Where am I now? That's a good question. I'm kind of in a what would I call that? Well, I've only been a professor for the last 3 years, and that's given me a lot of stability. But before it was a lot of freelancing and kind of just doing all the gigs that came up and doing all the things, chasing money. Basically, you have to pay the rent. And so having a stable kind of income that I enjoy doing is really nice. And I also have enough time to kind of start investing in projects that are different. So I've kind of come really full circle, and so I'm composing again. About 5 or 6 years ago, I started. Longer than that. I started composing again really seriously, and I did my doctorate in composition, and so I'm really doing that more, and playing more jazz again, getting back into doing that. And I have 2 new groups. I have a trio. I have an electric trio, and an acoustic trio. Acoustic trio in Geneva with double bass and drums, and an electric trio here in Paris with saxophone with pedals, electric guitar, and a guy with like a synthesizer and beats and stuff.
Wow.
So that's where I'm at right now. I'm like still playing in the groups that I play with like experimental contemporary music. I still play with a pianist, like playing very classical kind of stuff. And I have these 2 new groups which are like between improvised and kind of semi-fixed stuff. But let's just like total mayhem, which is I think what I always imagined was what I would be doing.
Right. Wow.
So that's nice to kind of
got to the top of a mountain.
Yeah, just to get to that point. There's a lot of work to be done, but it's nice to have the time and the energy and the colleagues to do that with.
Was that did you feel like you had the time and energy at the start? Like, was it intense starting when you started your, what do you call it? I want to call it a professorship.
It's my teaching job. Yeah,
teaching job.
It took me a couple of years to kind of figure out, like, because you have to prepare everything and like understand how to kind of it's a lot of I think it's a lot of responsibility. There's people that would do it perhaps without thinking about that, but I feel like it's a lot of responsibility. I have my saxophone studio, so I have 9 students there that come from one's from China, a few from Spain, from France, one from Switzerland, who have come, to study with me. And so you kind of have to mentor them, teach them about the instrument, teach them about a whole bunch of stuff. And then I have other classes that I give with other students. So it's kind of, you have to prepare and be on the ball.
Yeah.
But I feel like I figured it out. Now I know kind of what I need to be doing. And that's a long-term kind of project, having a class like that is like a 30-year kind of project.
What do you mean?
Well, it's like you're kind of...
They're probably, like, individual students probably aren't going to do it for 30 years.
No. Well, they'll be with me for between 2 and 7 years, depending on what kind of degree programs they're doing. But when you're in that kind of position, you're essentially... Because, there's one teacher at this school, which is like the superior school. And then you have 2 other conservatories in Geneva, which are from like students that learn up until they're like 17 or 18. And there's maybe 7 or 8 teachers in those 2 schools combined. And then you have all the music schools from the region, and there would be another 20 teachers, I guess, in that. So you're kind of training the next generations to kind of teach in all those schools. So you're not just training the students in your class, you're training the students in their classes. And
I see.
So it's a long-term project. It's a big deal to kind of have a pedagogy that is understood by the students and then is transferable to their students and is kind of holistic. And so it's a big... I take that really seriously. I think it's a big deal.
That's beautiful. Yeah, and if you take it seriously, you can have a wonderful effect.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. Let's see.
That's so exciting. But I can imagine that would take a long time getting used to. Yeah,
it took a little while to it's a lot of responsibility, I think.
Yeah, I had that moving to France. I think it's been the last few months that I've finally been comfortable enough to start thinking about not just making money and sort of getting through days.
Doing the thing that you want to be doing. 'Cause that's what it's all about, isn't it? It's finding the time to do the thing and kind of not just keep doing the thing that you know how to do, but kind of expand and grow.
Water yourself.
You gotta water yourself, man. That's what I always say. I'm like, what are you doing tomorrow? I'm gonna water myself. Some people look at me strangely, but not you.
No, I know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about.
Well, I feel like we've talked a fair while. I haven't really kept track, but that seems like a lovely place to conclude. Do you want to say are there any advertisements you want to put out to our millions of subscribers?
I don't know. I'm not very good at that kind of thing. Just follow me on Instagram. I don't know.
Follow him on Instagram.
There you go.
And any sage advice?
Like I said,
what would you say to a young musician right now trying to figure out what to do?
Figure out what to
do. Especially if they haven't gone into uni or anything. Real young whippersnappers. I have no idea if anyone likes that. It's gonna.
To all you young whippersnappers out there.
That's what.
I mean, I think that listening is just the key, isn't it? Listening. You know, the best musicians are the ones that know how to listen. Mm. That's it. The best people are the ones that know how to listen as well.
That's really lovely. I like that.
And I think that when I have students, or when you're kind of doing the entrance exams with students, or you're like meeting musicians, the ones that know how to listen are always the best ones. The ones that have spent time actively listening to stuff. Because that's what it's all about, isn't it? Just listening. So if you know how to listen, you can go far. If you don't have time for listening, then you probably should do something else. if you don't enjoy it, and that's another thing, if you don't enjoy listening, then like if you're not going to gigs, and all you want is to have people hear your thing.
Called out here. Go
on. I mean, like, one of my favorite things to do is listen to music. Like, I could just listen to music all day, every day, and be very happy. That's like what I spent most of my kind of teenage years doing, was just like listening constantly to music. And it's still one of my favorite things to do, and I love going to concerts and like seeing the weirdest shit, or like discovering, like, I love doing that. And if you can combine that with a love of just practicing your craft, like if you really enjoy practicing, you just enjoy spending time in the studio doing stuff, then I think you can go far. That's all I know.
It's beautiful.
That's all I know. Thank you, Toby, for having me.
Thanks, Josh.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been. Bye. If this one all just one